The sound of Judge Richard Coleman's gavel echoed through the Cook County courtroom in Chicago. He despised delays, and even more so, lawyers who thought they could grandstand in his courtroom. When the woman entered, he barely hid his disdain. Too young. Too confident. His eyes scanned her quickly. A well-tailored blazer, an impeccable posture, eyes as sharp as blades. But none of that mattered. In his mind, she had already lost the moment she stepped inside. Let's get this over with. I assume you're another public defender trying to make a point. But do me a favor, don't waste my time. We have more important cases to handle. The woman stopped in the center of the courtroom, staring at him with unsettling calm. The silence stretched, growing heavier with every second. The audience exchanged glances, sensing the tension. The bailiff cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably. But she didn't flinch, didn't waver, didn't blink. After a few moments, she reached into a leather folder, pulled out a document, and walked up to the judge's bench, placing the paper on the polished wood with deliberate precision. I believe this will clarify things, Your Honor. Coleman snatched the document without a care, still smirking. But as soon as his eyes landed on the first line, his world came crashing down. His breath hitched, his face drained of color. The courtroom seemed to spin as he reread the words that made him feel like a complete fool. State of Illinois Prosecutor's Office, official appointment of Chief Prosecutor, Gabrielle Lawson. A wave of murmurs spread through the attorneys and spectators. He had made an irreversible mistake. He had dismissed, patronized, and outright insulted none other than the chief prosecutor of the state, the very person who could turn his career into a disaster with a single report. Gabrielle remained still, her expression unreadable. It wasn't anger. It wasn't satisfaction. It was patience. The kind of patience that came from experience, from knowing exactly how this was going to end. Coleman gripped the arms of his chair, feeling a cold sweat slide down the back of his neck. But the truth was now crystal clear. He was no longer in control of this courtroom. Now, he was the one at a disadvantage. For the first time in his career, Judge Richard Coleman was speechless. His fingers stiffened as he set the document down, his mind racing for a way to regain control. The bold letters on the page burned into his vision. Chief Prosecutor of the State of Illinois. He had belittled, dismissed, and outright insulted one of the most powerful legal figures in the state. And now, the entire courtroom was watching. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Whispers rippled through the room like a slow-moving wave. A law clerk near the back let out a quiet, nervous chuckle, quickly stifled when his colleague shot him a sharp look. Coleman could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him. The attorneys, the spectators, the court officers, they all knew what had just happened. He had lost control. Clearing his throat, he adjusted his robe, trying to summon authority he no longer possessed. Well, it appears I was misinformed. His voice, though steady, lacked its usual commanding edge. He shifted in his chair. Let's proceed with the case. Gabrielle didn't move. Instead, she let the silence linger, forcing him to sit in the discomfort of his own mistake. Then, with measured grace, she stepped forward. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, the sound sharp and deliberate, cutting through the quiet like a scalpel. Stopping just short of his bench, she looked at him. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with something worse. Cold patience. With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe there's another matter we need to address first. Coleman's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what she was referring to. And so did everyone else. He cast a quick glance at the defense table. The opposing attorney leaned back in his chair, smirking, enjoying every second. Young prosecutors in the audience were riveted, leaning forward slightly, eyes wide as if they were witnessing history unfold. Even the bailiff, a man who had worked beside Coleman for over a decade, shifted awkwardly, as if uncertain whether he should step in or just let the moment play out. Gabrielle turned slightly, her voice unwavering. "Before we continue, I'd like it formally acknowledged that this court operates under the principles of impartiality and respect." She paused, her gaze locking onto Coleman's. "I trust that moving forward, I will be treated as such. Not as an outsider. Not as someone who doesn't belong here. But as the chief prosecutor of the state of Illinois." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The stenographer, usually an unshakable fixture in the courtroom, shifted in her seat. Coleman exhaled slowly through his nose. He could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. There was no way out of this. He had two choices: fight back and risk turning this moment into a career-ending disaster, or acknowledge his mistake and move forward. His grip on the gavel tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Duly noted." The words felt like swallowing broken glass. For a brief moment, he thought he had escaped with only a bruised ego. But then, Gabrielle leaned in slightly, just enough that only he could hear. "Careful, Your Honor," she murmured, her voice soft, measured. "Some mistakes don't get second chances." Coleman swallowed hard. Because in that moment, he realized, this was no longer his courtroom. It was hers. Judge Richard Coleman sat rigid in his chair, gripping the gavel so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law, it had become a stage for his humiliation. And he knew it. Gabrielle Lawson remained at the prosecution's table, poised, composed, completely unshaken. She wasn't gloating, wasn't reveling in the shift of power, but that almost made it worse. She had no need to rub it in. The damage was already done, and she knew it would follow him far beyond the walls of this room. The murmurs in the audience had died down, but the air remained heavy with an unspoken truth. Richard Coleman was no longer in control. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to move past his embarrassment. He was still the judge here. This was still his courtroom. "Let's proceed," he said, his voice a touch rougher than intended. He flipped through the case file, attempting to restore normalcy. State of Illinois versus Thomas Grayson. The defendant is charged with aggravated assault. Ms. Lawson, you may begin. Gabrielle stood, smoothing the front of her blazer before stepping toward the jury box. "Thank you, Your Honor." It was a simple phrase, but the way she said it, precise, deliberate, unshaken, made it clear. She was in control now, and everyone knew it. She turned to the jury, her posture confident but not arrogant. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's case is not complicated. It is about a choice, a violent, deliberate choice that left an innocent man in the hospital. The evidence will show that Thomas Grayson acted with clear intent, and by the time this trial is over, I have no doubt that you will see that justice must be served." Her words carried weight. Authority. She was commanding the room in a way that Coleman should have been. The defense attorney, Patrick Reynolds, shifted in his seat, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp. He had been in enough courtrooms to recognize when power had changed hands. And right now, it belonged to Gabrielle Lawson. Coleman swallowed down his frustration. He couldn't afford to lose control again, not today. He had already made one mistake, one that could cost him far more than just his pride. As the trial proceeded, he forced himself to focus, calling objections, ruling on motions, trying to remind everyone, including himself, that he still held authority here. But it wasn't the same. The energy in the courtroom had shifted. The way attorneys looked at him had changed. And worst of all, he knew the whispers wouldn't stop when court adjourned. By tomorrow morning, the entire legal community in Chicago would be talking about this. About him. About the judge who had made the wrong assumption about the wrong woman and paid the price. For the first time in his long career, Richard Coleman wasn't sure if his reputation would survive it. Judge Richard Coleman sat behind the towering mahogany bench, but for the first time, it no longer felt like his throne. The trial had been moving forward for the past hour, but he barely heard the testimonies, barely registered the motions and objections. He was still replaying his mistake over and over in his mind. The way the courtroom had turned against him. The way Gabrielle Lawson had effortlessly taken control. And the way everyone had noticed. Every so often, he caught the eyes of the attorneys, some cautious, some amused, all aware. Even the court stenographer, usually expressionless, had given him a quick, subtle glance that sent a clear message. Everyone is talking about this. He straightened his robe, clearing his throat. Ms. Lawson, you may proceed with your next witness. Gabrielle nodded, rising from her seat. Poised, unshaken, still in control. She walked to the center of the courtroom, holding the jury's attention with a presence that commanded respect. The state calls Dr. Andrew Wells to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and a middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit walked in, carrying a briefcase. A medical expert. Coleman rubbed his temples. He knew where this was going. Gabrielle was about to dismantle the defense's argument piece by piece. The bailiff swore in the witness, and Gabrielle wasted no time. Dr. Wells, can you confirm that the injuries sustained by the victim, Mr. Samuel Carter, are consistent with an intentional act of violence? Yes, without question. And in your professional opinion, could these injuries have been caused by anything other than direct, physical assault? No. The pattern of fractures and bruising indicate repeated, deliberate force. Coleman stole a glance at Patrick Reynolds, the defense attorney. He saw the man shift in his seat, adjusting his tie, preparing his counterarguments. But what stood out most was the way he kept looking at Gabrielle, not as an opponent, but as a serious threat. The realization was suffocating. That's how they see her now. Not just as a prosecutor, but as the most powerful person in this courtroom. He forced himself to focus. He needed to reassert his authority, to remind them that he was still the judge here. Ms. Lawson, he said, keeping his tone firm, let's keep the questioning concise. She turned to him slowly, her expression unreadable. But in her silence, there was something undeniable, a quiet challenge. Of course, Your Honor. The words were polite, but Coleman could hear the edge beneath them. He could see the slight raise of an eyebrow, the hint of knowing in her gaze. She wasn't afraid of him. And worse, everyone in the room could see that, too. As the questioning continued, Coleman felt his own relevance fading, his control slipping further. The attorneys weren't looking at him for guidance. They were looking at her. By the time the court adjourned for lunch, Coleman barely heard his own gavel hit the desk. He remained seated as the attorneys and jury filed out, his hands gripping the armrests. Then, as Gabrielle walked past his bench, she paused just long enough to say one thing, just loud enough for him to hear. "Enjoy your lunch, Your Honor." She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because in this courtroom, she had already won. Richard Coleman sat in his office, staring at the cold cup of coffee on his desk. His chambers, once a sanctuary where he ruled with unquestioned authority, now felt small, suffocating. Since the court had adjourned for lunch, he hadn't been able to think about anything else. That moment in the courtroom. The mistake everyone had witnessed. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. His assistant, Daniel Porter, stepped inside, looking hesitant. "Judge, you might want to see this." Coleman took the phone from Daniel's hand, frowning as he looked at the screen. His stomach dropped. A headline from the Chicago Tribune read, "Judge Coleman disrespects chief prosecutor, gets publicly humiliated in court." The article detailed everything. His dismissive attitude. The exact moment he realized his mistake. The way Gabrielle Lawson had taken control of the room without raising her voice. He scrolled further. The story had already left the courtroom. Now, it was on the streets. Closing his eyes for a brief moment, he pinched the bridge of his nose. Damn reporters. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his watch before speaking again. "Sir, it's not just the Tribune. This is all over legal circles. Lawyers are calling it the moment." Coleman looked up sharply. "The moment?" Daniel nodded, carefully choosing his next words. "The moment when everyone realized you weren't in control of that courtroom anymore." Coleman felt the weight of those words hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a mistake. It was an attack on his authority. If this continued, he wouldn't just be the judge who underestimated the wrong woman. He would be the judge who lost the respect of his own court. He took a deep breath and stood up. "Let's get back." Daniel gave a quick nod and opened the door. As Coleman adjusted his robe and stepped out of his office, the hum of the courtroom returning to order filled his ears. Lawyers were settling in, jurors were taking their seats. He climbed up to his bench and surveyed the room. Something had changed. Some of the faces looked different now. His eyes landed on Chief Prosecutor Gabrielle Lawson. She sat calmly, flipping through her notes as if nothing had happened. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She didn't need to, because this courtroom was already hers. Judge Richard Coleman gripped the sides of his bench as the courtroom settled back in. The voices of attorneys murmuring, the shuffle of papers, the low hum of whispered conversations, everything felt different now. He could feel it in the way people looked at him. Not with the usual respect, not even with fear. With doubt. Clearing his throat, he picked up his gavel and banged it against the wood, a little harder than necessary. "Court is back in session. Ms. Lawson, you may proceed with your next witness." Gabrielle stood, smooth as ever, completely unshaken. "The state calls Officer Raymond Carter to the stand." A uniformed police officer walked through the doors and took his seat at the witness stand. The bailiff swore him in, and Gabrielle approached, maintaining her usual air of authority. "Officer Carter, can you confirm that you were the first on the scene the night of the incident?" "Yes, ma'am." "And what did you witness upon arrival?" The victim, Mr. Samuel Carter, was lying unconscious on the pavement. The defendant, Thomas Grayson, was standing over him with his fists still clenched. There was fresh blood on his knuckles. A few jurors shifted in their seats. The weight of the testimony was undeniable. Coleman exhaled, trying to steady himself. He needed to regain control, to remind everyone that he was still in charge here. "Ms. Lawson, keep your questioning concise," he interrupted. Gabrielle turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Your Honor." But there was something in her voice, something just beneath the surface. She wasn't intimidated. Not even close. As she continued, Coleman noticed something unsettling. The defense attorney, Patrick Reynolds, wasn't watching the witness. He was watching Gabrielle. Not with annoyance, not even with defiance. With caution. That's when it hit him. She wasn't just winning the case. She was winning the courtroom. Coleman's fingers curled into a fist beneath his robe. His name, his reputation, everything he had built over the years, was slipping away. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Judge Richard Coleman could feel it. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. No matter how many times he banged the gavel, no matter how hard he tried to keep his voice steady, the power had shifted. And everyone knew it. Gabrielle Lawson stood in front of the jury, delivering each question with the same unshakable confidence. Every word she spoke commanded attention, her presence radiating control. The defense team barely interrupted. The jury was engaged, nodding along. Even the spectators, many of whom had started this trial believing Coleman was untouchable, now saw something different. They saw a judge losing his grip. Coleman clenched his jaw, glancing at the court reporter. Even she seemed more focused on Gabrielle than on him. His stomach twisted. Was this how it would be from now on? He had spent decades crafting his authority, ensuring that his courtroom ran on his terms. But today, he had been reduced to nothing more than a bystander in his own court. All because of one mistake. And Gabrielle wasn't letting him forget it. "Your Honor," she said suddenly, turning to face him. Coleman straightened, gripping the armrests of his chair. "Yes, Ms. Lawson?" Given the overwhelming evidence and the testimony provided, the prosecution moves to deny the defense's latest motion to suppress key witness statements. Coleman hesitated. His instinct was to grant the motion, to remind everyone that he was still in charge. But he knew that if he ruled against Gabrielle, it would be obvious. Transparent. Desperate. The courtroom waited. All eyes on him. Gabrielle's gaze was steady, unwavering. She wasn't challenging him outright, but the message was clear. Choose your next move carefully, Judge. His fingers tapped against the bench. His heart pounded in his chest. And then, against his better judgment, he made a decision he would regret. "Motion granted," he said. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney barely hid his surprise. Even Gabrielle raised an eyebrow, though her expression remained unreadable. But the damage was done. Coleman expected relief. Expected to feel a sense of regained control. Instead, as he glanced around the courtroom, all he saw were quiet, knowing looks. They saw right through him. They saw a judge who was scared. The moment Richard Coleman granted the defense's motion, he knew he had made a mistake. The courtroom, which usually reacted to his rulings with quiet deference, now felt different. There were no murmurs of surprise, no subtle glances exchanged between attorneys. Instead, there was a heavy silence, a weight in the air that made everything feel denser. Gabrielle Lawson didn't protest. She didn't ask for reconsideration. She just stood there, still, watching him. And that was worse. Coleman felt the sweat gathering at the back of his neck. He tried to convince himself that he was still in control, that his ruling had been nothing more than a legitimate exercise of his authority. But the truth was impossible to ignore. He hadn't made that decision because it was right. He had made it because he was trying to prove that he was still in charge. And everyone knew it. Defense attorney Patrick Reynolds blinked a few times before rising to thank the judge. His tone remained professional, but there was a slight hesitation before he spoke, as if he hadn't expected Coleman to cave so easily. The jurors looked distracted, some avoiding eye contact with the judge altogether, as if they weren't sure what to think about what had just happened. The young lawyers in the back exchanged quick glances. They understood what was going on. And in a few hours, so would everyone else in Chicago's legal circles. Coleman's throat felt dry as he banged the gavel. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow. The murmurs started as soon as the chairs scraped against the floor. The attorneys and spectators began filing out, but the atmosphere was different. They weren't just leaving another day in court. They were leaving with a story to tell. He remained seated, unmoving, watching as the jurors exited one by one. His mind spun in circles, searching for a way to justify what he had just done. Nothing felt convincing. Then, a voice cut through the silence. "That was disappointing, Your Honor." He looked up. Gabrielle Lawson was still there, gathering her papers at the prosecution's table. She didn't look directly at him, but her words carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Coleman swallowed, adjusting in his chair. "I ruled based on my interpretation of the law." Gabrielle closed her folder and slipped the strap of her coat over her shoulder. "Of course." She said it so neutrally that Coleman couldn't tell whether it was sarcasm or pure indifference. She walked toward the exit but paused just before stepping through the doors. "Judge, just so you know, desperate decisions are the easiest to spot." And then she was gone. Coleman sat there, alone, in the empty courtroom. Slowly, he let out a breath and ran a hand down his face. He was losing control. But worse than that, he knew he might never get it back. Richard Coleman walked into the courtroom the next morning, his steps slower than usual. Something felt different. The moment he sat down at the bench, he could sense it. The air in the room was heavier, charged with an unspoken shift. People weren't looking at him the same way. He scanned the room. The defense team sat quietly, whispering among themselves, but there was something in their posture. Less tension, more confidence. The jurors filed in, their eyes flicking toward him, then away, as if unsure of what to expect from him today. Even the bailiff, a man who had worked alongside him for over a decade, seemed more formal, more distant. And then there was Gabrielle Lawson. She sat at the prosecution's table, flipping through her notes with the same calm focus she always had. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. But she didn't have to. She had already won. Coleman gripped his gavel, his fingers tightening around the handle. He cleared his throat and straightened his robe. Court is now in session. His voice sounded the same, but it no longer carried the same weight. The proceedings began, but something was off. He could feel the doubt lingering in the air, suffocating him. The attorneys weren't looking at him for authority anymore. The jury wasn't hanging on his every word. The courtroom wasn't his anymore. Halfway through the session, Patrick Reynolds, the defense attorney, stood up to object. "Your Honor, I believe the prosecution is leading the witness." Coleman hesitated. A simple objection. Routine. He had ruled on motions like this thousands of times. But today, he felt the weight of every decision. If he ruled in favor of Gabrielle, would they think he was trying to compensate for yesterday? If he ruled against her again, would they see it as another desperate attempt to reclaim authority? For the first time in his career, he hesitated on a ruling. The silence stretched. Gabrielle looked up from her notes, waiting. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The entire courtroom was watching. Finally, Coleman forced out a response. "The objection is sustained." Reynolds gave a small nod, but Coleman could see the recognition in his eyes. He hesitated. He's second-guessing himself. Coleman swallowed. The doubt had spread beyond the rumors, beyond the whispers. Now it was real. When the session adjourned, the attorneys gathered their papers, filing out one by one. Coleman stayed seated, feeling a strange hollowness settle in his chest. Then, as Gabrielle walked past his bench, she paused. For a moment, he thought she was going to say something. But instead, she just met his gaze, not with defiance, not with pity. Just certainty. Then she turned and walked out. And for the first time in his career, Judge Richard Coleman wondered if his reign over this courtroom was coming to an end. By the time the trial reached its final day, Judge Richard Coleman knew the inevitable had happened. He had spent years believing that his authority was unshakable, that his name alone commanded respect. But in just a few days, that illusion had crumbled. His control over the courtroom was gone. He sat at the bench, staring down at the room that had once belonged to him. The attorneys weren't waiting for his guidance anymore. The jury barely looked at him. Even the court staff seemed different, more distant, more indifferent. And then there was Gabrielle Lawson. She stood at the prosecution's table, delivering her closing arguments with the same unwavering confidence that had shattered his authority days ago. Her voice was steady, measured, and absolute. This case has never been about speculation. It has never been about doubt. The evidence speaks for itself, and justice demands accountability. Today, I ask you to see the truth that has been in front of us from the very beginning. The courtroom was silent, hanging onto her every word. Coleman watched, but he wasn't the one in control anymore. He was just another spectator. When the jury left to deliberate, he felt the weight of the past few days crash down on him. The whispers, the headlines, the way people looked at him now, not as a powerful judge, but as a man whose time had passed. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. As Coleman read the sentence, his voice felt hollow, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. When he banged the gavel for the final time, it no longer felt like a declaration of authority. It felt like an ending. The court adjourned, and people began to leave. Gabrielle gathered her things, methodical as always. But as she passed by his bench, she stopped just for a moment. She looked at him, not with arrogance, not with mockery, but with certainty. "Have a good evening, Your Honor." It was a simple phrase. Polite. Professional. But Coleman heard exactly what she meant. This was no longer his courtroom. It was hers. As the doors closed behind her, he sat alone in the empty room, staring at the bench in front of him. For the first time in his career, he wondered if he even belonged there anymore.